Good evening. Settle in. Let the warmth of the hearth push back the chill of the world outside. There's a story waiting in the embers, a mystery as quiet and as deep as the night itself. This is Cold-Blooded Cases, where we explore the shadows, view of human nature, not with a racing heart, but with the steady, measured rhythm of a clock ticking in a silent room. Tonight, we journey to a place forgotten by time, to unravel a puzzle left behind by a man who made secrets his life's work. This is the story of the silent cipher of Blackwood Manor. Our story begins not with a scream, but with a silence. A profound and unnatural quiet that fell over a remote corner of the world. An island nestled in the misty, grey-green waters of the Pacific Northwest. The locals call it Solitude Island, a name earned through long, fog-shrouded winters and a population that values privacy above all else. The island is a tapestry of ancient Douglas firs, their branches heavy with moss and jagged basalt cliffs that stand as stoic sentinels against the relentless push and pull of the Pacific tide. On the island's most secluded point, accessible only by a winding private road that seems to want to lose you in the woods, stands Blackwood Manor. It was less a manor and more a fortress of solitude, built from the island's own dark stone and timber, designed to blend into the perpetual twilight of the forest. It was the home of Elias Vance, a man as enigmatic as the island he chose for his exile. Vance was a horologist by trader, master clockmaker, but that title was a simplification, like calling a composer a musician. He was a philosopher of time itself. His creations were not mere time-telling devices. They were intricate, mechanical marvels of astronomy, automata, and cryptography. Each clock was a puzzle box, its gears and levers a secret language understood only by its creator. In his later years, Elias Vance had become a recluse, his only contact with the outside world being the occasional delivery of rare parts and correspondences with academic circles about theoretical mathematics and historical ciphers. He was a ghost in his own home, a legend in a town of fewer than 300 people who rarely, if ever, saw him. The silence that begins our story fell on a Tuesday in late October. The autumn rains had come early that year, a constant, gentle drumming on the slate roof of the manor. Mrs. Albright, the manor's housekeeper, and a woman whose loyalty to Elias Vance was as steadfast and silent as the stones of the house itself, was the first to notice the disturbance in the perfect clockwork routine of the household. For 27 years, her employer's day had been governed by an unwavering precision. At precisely 7 a.m., a small bell, connected by a series of hidden wires to the master study, would chime once in the kitchen. This was Mrs. Albright's signal to deliver a tray with black coffee and a single plain scone. At 1 p.m., it would chime twice for a light lunch. At 7 p.m., it would chime 3 times for dinner. On that Tuesday, the 7 a.m. bell did not chime. Mrs. Albright, a woman whose face was a roadmap of quiet worries, felt a flicker of unease. Still, she waited. Mr. Vance was a man of habit, but even the most perfect clock didn't sometimes skip a beat. She busied herself with her morning duties, dusting the grand, silent rooms filled with towering grandfather clocks, their pendulums all stilled by order of their master years ago. He could not bear the chaos of a dozen different heartbeats in his home. Only the master clock in his study was allowed to keep time. 8 a.m. came and went. Then 9 a.m. The silence from the study, usually a sign of deep concentration, began to feel heavy, oppressive. She approached the study door, a massive slab of dark oak. She knocked softly. Mr. Vance, only the sound of the rain answered. Knocked again, louder this time. Sir, your coffee is ready. The silence that met her was absolute. It was then that a genuine, cold tendril of fear coiled in her stomach. She tried the handle. It was, as always, locked from the inside. Elias Vance's study was his sanctuary. No one, not even Mrs. Albright, had a key. It was an inviolable space. She spent the next few hours in a state of escalating panic, pacing the long-shadowed hallway outside the study. She called his private line, listening to it ring and ring unanswered in the sealed room. By midday, when the 1 p.m. bell also failed to chime, she knew something was terribly wrong. Her hands trembling, she made a call she hadn't made in over a decade. She called the island's resident lawman, Sheriff Brody. Sheriff Brody was a man well suited to the pace of Solitude Island. His duties mostly consisted of settling minor disputes over fishing rights, ticketing the occasional tourist for speeding, and ensuring the ferry dock was clear during storms. A potential crisis at the infamous Blackwood Manor was the most significant event of his career. He arrived in his salt-stained pickup truck, his face etched with a concern that was both professional and personal. He, like everyone else on the island, knew of the legend of Elias Vance. Together, he and a distraught Mrs. Albright stood before the oak door. Brody's heavy, authoritative knocks echoed in the hall, but yielded the same result. Nothing. There was no other way in. The study's windows were tall and narrow, more like arrow slits in a castle than windows in a home, and they were, upon inspection from the outside, securely latched. There was no choice. With a heavy sigh and a nod of apology to the housekeeper, Sheriff Brody used a heavy iron pry bar from his truck. The sound of splintering wood as the old lock gave way was a shocking violation in the otherwise silent house. The room within was dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight. Brody flicked a switch by the door, and a low, warm light filled the space, and there the story truly begins. The scene was one of perfect, undisturbed order. Books on cryptography and mechanical engineering lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Intricate brass instruments lay neatly arranged on a side table. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, metallic scent of oil. And in the center, by the room, behind a grand mahogany desk, sat Elias Vance. He was slumped in his backed leather chair, his head resting against his chest, as if he had simply fallen asleep while reading. His hands were folded peacefully in his lap. On the desk before him, The only object that seemed out of place was a teacup, cold and half full. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. The room was sealed. The door was locked from the inside, and the man within was dead. Sheriff Brody, feeling profoundly out of his depth, secured the scene and made the necessary call to the mainland. He requested a forensics team and, more importantly, a detective. The case, he knew, was far beyond the scope of a small-town sheriff. It required a mind that could navigate not just evidence, but enigmas. It required someone who could understand, a man like Elias Vance. The man who answered that call was Detective Miles Corbin. Corbin was, in many ways, the antithesis of the modern, fast-paced detective. He was a man in his late 50s, with tired eyes that had seen the worst of city crime for 3 decades. He had recently transferred to the quiet regional precinct that oversaw the islands, seeking a peaceful end to a long career. He was a patient man, a listener, a watcher. He moved with a deliberation that some mistook for slowness, but was, in fact, a deep-seated habit of observation. He didn't just look at a crime scene. He absorbed it. When Detective Corbin arrived at Blackwood Manor the following morning, the island was draped in its customary shroud of fog. The house loomed out of the mist, its stone walls slick with rain, looking like a secret that the world had tried and failed to bury. He greeted Sheriff Brody with a quiet nod and listened without interruption as Brody recounted the events. Corbin's gaze drifted over the imposing facade of the manor, taking in the narrow, barred windows of the study. A fortress, indeed. He entered the house and was met by the funereal silence. Mrs. Albright, her face pale and drawn, offered him a cup of tea, which he accepted gratefully. He didn't ask her questions, not yet. He simply sat with her for a moment in the cavernous, cold kitchen, letting the silence speak. He learned more from her trembling hands and the way her eyes darted towards the hallway than any immediate interrogation could have revealed. Then he went to the study. He stood in the doorway for a long time, his eyes slowly scanning every inch of the room. The forensics team had been and gone, dusting for prints and taking samples, but the room was largely as it had been found. It was a time capsule, a map of one man's mind. Corbin noted the books, not just their subjects, but their arrangement. He saw the precision in the placement of tools on the workbench. This was the sanctuary of a mind that craved order, a mind that built systems to keep chaos at bay. And yet, chaos had found a way in. The medical examiner's preliminary report was on the desk. Cause of death was inconclusive pending toxicology, but was suspected to be cardiac arrest. There were no marks on the body, no signs of violence or trauma. It was as if Elias Vance's internal clock had simply and suddenly stopped ticking. But Corbin knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it wasn't that simple. Men like Vance didn't just stop. Their lives were a crescendo of complexity. Their deaths were unlikely to be a simple, quiet fade to black. Corbin's attention was drawn to the desk. It was an immense piece of furniture, the surface a landscape of its own. In the very center, placed with deliberate care, was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper. It was not a suicide note. It was not a letter. It was a cipher, a series of symbols, meticulously drawn in black ink, covered the top half of the page. Some looked like astrological signs, others like obscure algebraic notations, and some were unique glyphs of Vance's own invention. Below the symbols, a single haunting line was written in his elegant, spidery script. The serpent devours its own tail. Yet the clock's hands are frozen at the dawn of the final day, and below that, the page was blank. The ink on the final word was slightly feathered, as if the pen had rested there for a moment too long before being lifted. It was unfinished, an interruption. This, Corbin thought, was the heart of it. This was the true scene of the crime. Not the room, not the body, but this single, silent piece of paper. It was Vance's last communication, a message from beyond the veil of a locked door. What did it mean? Was it a clue he was leaving for someone? A warning? Or was it merely the last wandering thought of a brilliant mind as it flickered out? Corbin spent the next hour alone in the study. He didn't touch anything. He simply stood and later sat in a guest chair, letting the atmosphere of the room settle over him. He imagined Elias Vance sitting at that desk, the world outside held at bay by stone and secrets. He saw the man's obsession with time, with order, with control. The locked door was a part of that. It wasn't just for privacy. It was a statement. I control who and what enters my world. And yet, someone or something had breached the walls, not with force, but with the subtlety of a poison, the stealth of a whisper. He examined the teacup. The forensics team had bagged it, but its image was clear in the crime scene photos. It was delicate porcelain, part of a set Corbin had seen in the kitchen. Mrs. Albright had confirmed that she had not brought him any tea that day or the evening before. Vance rarely drank tea. Coffee was his fuel. So where had the tea come from, and what was in it? The toxicology report would take days, maybe weeks. Until then, Corbin had only the room, the silence, and the cipher. Dot, as the grey afternoon light began to fade, casting long, distorted shadows across the study. Corbin knew his investigation had to expand beyond these stone walls. A man this reclusive doesn't have a wide circle of friends, but enemies can be cultivated from a distance. Resentment can fester across oceans. Greed can travel on the whisper of a phone call. His first formal interview was, by necessity, with Mrs. Albright. He found her in the kitchen, staring into a cold fireplace. He spoke softly, his voice a low, calming murmur against the rhythm of the rain. Mrs. Albright, he began, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me about Mr. Vance's world. Who was in it, even from a distance? The housekeeper took a long, shaky breath. His world was this house, Detective, these clocks, his books. She paused, her gaze distant. There was his niece, Evelyn. She's his only living relative. He and her father, his brother, were estranged for decades. After his brother passed, Evelyn would write, once or twice a year, formal letters, asking for money, I suspect. He never wrote back, but he read them. Evelyn Vance, Corbin noted. Where does she live? Back east. Boston, I think. She came to visit once, about 5 years ago, unannounced. He wouldn't see her. She stood on the doorstep for an hour, shouting at the door. Then she left. He was disturbed by it for weeks. An air, spurned and resentful. Motive, clear as a bell. Anyone else? Corbin pressed gently. Business dealings. Rivals. Mrs. Albright hesitated. There was a man. A Mr. Croft. Julian Croft. He's one of those new technology men from California. He wanted to buy Mr. Vance's patents. The ones for his micro-escapements. He said he wanted to digitize them, use them in smart devices. He offered a fortune. And Mr. Vance's response, a thin, humorless smile, touched Mrs. Albright's lips. He sent Mr. Croft a single-word reply via telegram. No, Croft was persistent. He wrote letters. He called. He even tried to hire a lawyer to argue that Mr. Vance's patents were not being used to their full potential and should be made public. Mr. Vance called him a vulture, a man who saw time only as something to be packaged and sold, a business, prival, aggressive, and denied a fortune. Another clear motive. Finally, Corbin asked about the house itself, the locks, the security. The study door, Mrs. Albright confirmed, was special. Mr. Vance designed the lock himself. It's a puzzle lock. You have to turn the key a certain number of times, pause, then turn it the other way in a specific sequence. Only he knew it. From the inside, it was a simple bolt, a heavy, solid brass bolt. He would slide into place every morning. So if the bolt was slid across from the inside, Corbin mused, thinking aloud, how could anyone get in or out? They couldn't, she said, with certainty. That's the point. It's impossible. Be a locked room mystery, a dead genius, a cryptic, unfinished message, and a list of suspects, distant but with powerful motives. As Detective Corbin stood on the porch of Blackwood Manor, the fog now so thick it seemed to swallow the world just a few feet from his face, he felt the chill of the case settle upon him. It was a cold, quiet puzzle, just like the man who had left it behind. The solution, he suspected, was not in a flurry of action or a shocking confession. It was hidden, somewhere in the silence, in the intricate gears of Elias Vance's life, and in the strange, symbolic language of his final, cryptic testament. The first key, he knew, would be to unlock the meaning of that cipher, the serpent devouring its own tail, the frozen hands of a clock. It was a riddle, and solving it was the only way to give a voice to the silent man in the locked room. The rain continued to fall, a soft, percussive beat, like a clock counting down the seconds until a secret is revealed. The first day of the investigation was over, but the long night was just beginning. A mystery is not a locked door to be broken down. It is a series of intricate, interlocking gears. To solve it, you must first understand the mechanism. Detective Miles Corbin understood this as he left Blackwood Manor that first evening. The image of Elias Vance's final cryptic message was burned into his mind. The serpent devours its own tail, yet the clock's hands are frozen at the dawn of the final day. It was not the lament of a dying man. It was a challenge. It was the first gear in a machine of unknown complexity. Corbin's temporary headquarters became a small, sparsely furnished room at the island's only in the Anchor and Pine. The window looked out over the grey, churning water of the Sound, a view that was both vast and confining. It was here, surrounded by case files and lukewarm coffee, that he began the slow, methodical process of disassembly. His investigation would proceed along 3 parallel tracks: the Cipher, the suspects, and the sanctuary, the house itself. Each had to be explored with a watchmaker's patience. His first call was not to a witness, but to an academic. He had found, among Vance's meticulously organized correspondences, a series of letters exchanged with a Professor Alistair Finch at the University of Washington's Department of Antiquities. Their letters were dense, filled with discussions of ancient mechanics, astrolabes, and pre-Roman symbolic languages. Finch, it seemed, was one of the few people who spoke a language Elias Vance understood. Corbin reached the professor in his cluttered, book-lined office. Finch had a voice that sounded exactly as Corbin imagined, dry as old parchment, but with an undercurrent of intellectual excitement. He remembered Elias Vance with a mixture of reverence and frustration. Elias Vance, Finch mused, after Corbin had introduced himself and the reason for his call. A singular mind, a true artist of the mechanical. He saw the universe as a grand clockwork, and believed that if you understood the gears, you could understand the mind of God. He was also, if you'll pardon my candor, detective, profoundly arrogant and paranoid. Paranoid in what way, Professor? Corbin asked, doodling a small spiralon or a baris on his notepad. He believed modern technology was a corruption, a dumbing down of the grand complexities he revered. He saw algorithms as cheap sleight of hand compared to the tangible, honest poetry of a perfectly balanced escapement wheel. His paranoia was intellectual. He wasn't afraid of spies in the bushes. He was afraid of the death of nuance, the erosion of deep thought. Corbin read the cipher to him. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence so profound Corbin could hear the faint hum of a fluorescent light in Finch's office, thousands of miles away in spirit. My word, Finch finally breathed. That's pure Elias. It's a statement of philosophy wrapped in a puzzle. The first part is simple enough for any student of symbology. The serpent devours its own tail is the Ouroboros. It is one of the oldest symbols in human history. It represents the eternal cycle of destruction and recreation of life and death. It can mean infinity, self-sufficiency, or a system that is perfectly closed, feeding on itself. Given Elias's worldview, he would have seen it as the perfect, self-contained system, like one of his clocks, or his own isolated life. A closed system, Corbin repeated softly. Like a locked room. Precisely, Finch exclaimed, his voice crackling with energy. You see the poetry of it, but it's the second half that's the true key. Yet the clock's hands are frozen at the dawn of the final day. That's a contradiction, a paradox. The Ouroboros is all about eternal movement, the unending cycle. But he speaks of stasis, of an end. The hands are frozen. The cycle is broken. He's presenting you with an impossible state of affairs. A cycle that has been stopped at its very beginning, the dawn. What could possibly interrupt an eternal, self-contained cycle? Only an outside force of immense power, or an inherent, catastrophic flaw that was always destined to break it. A flaw, Corbin mused, his mind turning over the idea. Or a poison. It could be a metaphor for his own mortality. Detective. The great clockmaker finally facing the fact that his own mechanism must run down. Or it could be something more literal, an instruction, a location. Elias didn't do anything by half measures. If he left a message, it would mean something tangible. The final day. What did that day mean to him? And at dawn, is he referring to a specific time? Does one of his clocks have an astronomical complication that marks a specific dawn? You must look at his work, detective. The answer isn't just in his words, it's in his creations. The conversation with Finch left Corbin with more questions than answers, but it also gave him a direction. The cipher was not just a riddle, it was a set of instructions. A map to a treasure or a truth, written in a language of symbols and gears. The next track was the suspects. He began with the easy one, the tech mogul, Julian Croft. Corbin reached him on his mobile phone. The connection was crisp, and in the background, Corbin could hear the energetic, caffeinated hum of a modern office. Croft's voice was smooth, confident, and radiated an almost aggressive impatience. Detective, yes, I've been expecting a call. A tragedy about Elias Vance. A true waste of talent, though mostly wasted by his own refusal to engage with the 21st century. You were interested in his patents, Mr. Croft? Corbin asked, keeping his tone neutral. Interested is an understatement. Croft scoffed. Elias Vance was sitting on a gold mine. His micro-escapement designs. His work on non-lubricated gear trains. It's revolutionary stuff. The man solved mechanical problems 100 years ahead of his time, then locked the solutions in a drawer. We could be using his principles to create self-powered medical implants, hyper-efficient micro-drones, batteries that last for decades. He could have changed the world. Instead, he made cuckoo clocks for billionaires and then hid in a cave. He refused your offers repeatedly and rudely, called me a vulture of progress, said I wanted to strip mine his soul for parts. The man was a Luddite, detective, Brian, but deeply troubled Luddite. He thought a gear had a soul. Can you imagine? Where were you on the day of his death, Mr. Croft, and the days leading up to it? Me. Croft laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. I was in Palo Alto in a series of board meetings. Then I flew to Singapore for a tech conference. My calendar is an open book. My travel records, my credit card statements, my EasyPA essays. It's all tracked, logged, and uploaded to the cloud. I assure you, I was nowhere near that mossy rock he called home. Look, detective, I wanted his patents, not his life. He was more valuable to me alive, where there was still a sliver of a chance I could persuade him, than dead, with his estate tangled in probate for years. Croft's alibi seemed solid, and his motive was for Vance to be alive. But Corbin knew that powerful men had long arms. Still, the direct approach seemed unlikely for a man like Croft. His weapon was money and lawyers, not stealth and poison. The call to the niece, Evelyn Vance, was a different experience entirely. She lived in a chic brownstone in Boston, and her voice was clipped, aristocratic, and tinged with a bitterness that was clearly decades old. "Yes, detective," she said, her voice cool. "I was informed by the estate lawyer. So, the old dragon is finally dead." The lack of sentiment was striking. "You and your uncle were not close?" Corbin asked. "Not close is a rather gentle way of putting it. My father and Elias were brothers who became mortal enemies. It was over our family's inheritance. My grandfather was a watchmaker, too, but a simple one. He left the business to both of them. My father wanted to modernize, to expand. Elias wanted to turn it into his private laboratory. Elias, being the more ruthless of the two, won. He bought my father out for a pittance and cut him off. My father died a bitter, impoverished man, and Elias never sent so much as a condolence card. "You visited him 5 years ago," Corbin stated. He could almost hear her jaw tighten over. "The phone. I did. A fool's errand. I had just finished my graduate degree and was buried in debt. Perhaps he might have a shred of familial decency left. I thought I could appeal to him. I stood on his doorstep and begged to speak with him. He had his housekeeper tell me he wasn't home, while I could literally see his shadow, moving past a window. I have never felt so humiliated in my life. Where were you on the days in question, Ms. Vance?" "I was in Boston. I'm a curator at a private art gallery. I was overseeing the installation of a new exhibit. Dozens of people saw me. My alibi, as I'm sure you'll call it, is impeccable." Like Croft, her alibi seemed secure, but her motive was dripping with venom. The inheritance, which she now stood to gain, would be substantial. "What do you know about his work?" Corbin asked. "His clocks, his ciphers." She laughed. A sound as cold as her voice. "I know that he loved them more than any human being. They were his children, cold, ticking, heartless children, just like him. He used to send my father puzzles for his birthday, impossible little cryptograms, not as gifts, but as taunts. A way to say, look how much smarter I am than you. I imagine his entire life was one long, self-satisfied puzzle that no one else was invited to solve. To suspects, both with strong motives, one of greed, one of revenge, and both with seemingly ironclad alibis. It was a classic conundrum. But Corbin knew alibis could be manufactured, and murder could be committed from a distance. The thought brought him back to the teacup. The preliminary toxicology report arrived via a secure email late that afternoon. Corbin read it twice, then a third time. The medical examiner had found no common poisons, no cyanide, no arsenic, no barbiturates, but acting on a hunch given the victim's age and the manner of death, they had run a specialized panel. And there it was, a lethal concentration of a substance called digoxin. Corbin wasn't a medical expert, but he knew the name. It was a cardiac glycoside, a powerful and highly controlled medication derived from the foxglove plant. In small, precise doses, it was used to treat heart failure. In a large dose, it was a potent, almost untraceable poison. It caused arrhythmias, nausea, and visual disturbances. Victims sometimes reported seeing yellow halos around objects before inducing a massive, fatal cardiac arrest. It would look, to all intents and purposes, like a natural heart attack. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. They had prescribed Elias Vance his death and served it in a teacup. The poison explained the how of the death, but not the how of the murder. The room was still locked from the inside. The heavy brass bolt was thrown. How did the killer get the poison into the cup, and how did they get out of the room, leaving it bolted behind them? With these questions swirling, Corbin returned to the manor the next day. The rain had finally stopped, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the tall firs, making the wet stone of the house glisten. Mrs. Albright let him in, her face etched with a permanent state of grief. Corbin had asked her to leave everything in the house untouched, and she had obeyed. He bypassed the study for now. He wanted to understand the rest of the man's world. He went first to the workshop. It was attached to the back of the house, a vast room with a soaring ceiling and a huge north-facing window that flooded the space with clean, even light. The room was a paradise of organization. Tools hung on the walls in perfect silhouetted rows. Bins of gears, springs, and screws were meticulously labeled in Vance's spidery script. And on a central workbench, under a velvet cloth, sat his final, unfinished project. Corbin lifted the cloth. It was a clock, but like no clock he had ever seen. It was a skeleton clock, its inner workings completely exposed. But instead of a circular dial, it was a sphere, a complex orrery, a mechanical model of the solar system, sat at its heart. Miniature brass planets orbited a central sun on impossibly fine arms. The entire mechanism was designed to track not just the hours and minutes, but the phases of the moon, the turning of the seasons, the alignment of the planets, and the slow 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis, known as the precession of the equinoxes. It was a clock designed to tell cosmic time, and it was unfinished. A single gear lay on the workbench beside it, along with a pair of fine tweezers. It was as if Vance had been in the very act of placing the final piece of his masterpiece, when he was interrupted for the last time. What had called him away from his life's work? A phone call, a visitor, or the sudden urge for a cup of tea he never usually drank. Corbin then moved to the library. It was a smaller, cozier room than the study, lined with leather-bound books. He ran his fingers along their spines, reading the titles. There were the expected works on horology, metallurgy, and mathematics, but there were also entire sections on alchemy, ancient astronomy, mythology, and philosophy. He found a heavily annotated copy of a book on hermetic symbolism. The chapter on the Ouroboros was underlined repeatedly. In the margins, Vance had written, "The system is perfect. The flaw must be introduced. The flaw must be introduced." The words echoed Professor Finch's analysis. Was Vance documenting his own murder, or was he planning something else? A test, a final game. Corbin pulled down a book on historical poisons. A page was doc-eared. It described the use of digitalis purpurea, the common foxglove, in medieval assassinations. It was known as the potion of the slow death for its ability to mimic natural causes. On that page, next to a woodcut illustration of the purple bell-shaped flower, was a small, faint pencil mark, a star. Elias Vance had been researching the very poison that killed him. Corbin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air of the old house. The puzzle was growing deeper, its layers more complex. Vance wasn't just a victim, he was a participant. He had been studying the weapon. He had written a cryptic note about a broken cycle. And then he had been found dead of that exact weapon in a room locked from the inside. It was then that Corbin's phone buzzed. It was Sheriff Brody. "Miles," Brody said, his voice tense. "You need to see this. Mrs. Albright was cleaning out the greenhouse, mister. Vance hadn't been in there in years. She says she found something." Corbin met Brody at the back of the property, where a dilapidated Victorian greenhouse stood, its glass panes clouded with grime and moss. Inside, the air was thick and humid. Overgrown, exotic-looking ferns fought for space with tangled vines. And in a far corner, growing in a simple terracotta pot set apart from the other plants, was a single tall stalk of foxglove, its purple flowers in full, vibrant bloom. It was being cultivated deliberately. The poison hadn't been brought to the island. It was already here. It was part of the system. Corbin stood there in the humid air of the greenhouse, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place like the gears of one of Vance's clocks. The self-contained system of the Ouroboros, the introduced flaw, the research into the poison, the cultivated plant, the locked room. This wasn't a simple case of murder. It wasn't about a greedy niece or an angry rival sneaking in to administer a poison. The mechanism was far more elegant, far more sinister. Elias Vance had, in a way, set the stage for his own death. The question was, had he been the director, or merely the lead actor in a play written by someone else? As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and grey, Corbin returned once more to the study. He stood before the grand master clock, the only one in the house that was still running. Its pendulum swung in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Its face was a marble of enamel and gold, marking the minutes, the hours, the phases of the moon. He remembered Professor Finch's words. Look at his work. The answer is in his creations. He looked closer at the clock face. At the top, where the number 12 would normally be, was a small, engraved Ouroboros. He looked at the hands. They were exquisitely carved, but seemed normal enough. He looked at the date window. It was all perfectly ordinary. But as his eyes scanned the intricate filigree round the dial, he saw it. A tiny inscription, almost invisible to the naked eye, engraved in the brass ring that held the glass. He had to angle his head to catch the light just right. It was a sequence of numbers and letters, not a cipher like the one on the desk, but a patent number. Corbin pulled out his phone, and in the deepening gloom of the silent study, with only the steady tick-tock of the master clock for company, he entered the number into the search engine. The result came back instantly. It was a patent filed by Elias Vance 15 years earlier. The title of the patent made the hairs on the back of Corbin's neck stand on end. It was for a temporal lid lamp, pressure-activated liquid dispensing mechanism. It was a device for a self-poisoning teacup, a machine to introduce the flaw into the system at a predetermined time. The serpent was about to devour itself, just as planned. But the final, critical question remained. Who had wound the clock? Of course, let the embers burn low and the world outside fade away. The final pieces of the puzzle are falling into place. Not with a crash, but with a soft, deliberate click of a well-made lock. Let us return one last time to the silent manor and the cold, intricate case of Elias Vance. Here is the final part. The sound of a softly crackling fire and the steady, gentle patter of rain remains, a comforting anchor in the quiet of the night. A complex machine can be undone by a single, imperfect gear. A fortress can be breached by one forgotten key, and a life dedicated to impenetrable systems can be ended by a single, elegant flaw. Detective Miles Corbin now held the blueprint of that flaw in his hand, displayed on the cold, blue light of his phone screen. A patent for a machine of murder so subtle, so patient, it bordered on the sublime, a temporarily delayed dispensing mechanism, a teacup that was also a time bomb. The how was no longer a ghost. It had a shape, a name, a patent number. Elias Vance had been killed by his own genius, turned back on itself. The poison was grown in his own gardens. The delivery system was a product of his own mind. The Ouroboros, the serpent of his final message, had truly devoured itself. But a machine, no matter how sophisticated, needs an operator. A clock, no matter how precise, needs someone to wind it and set the time. Who had set this fatal appointment? For Elias Vance, and when? Corbin's investigation pivoted from the physical to the temporal. The key was in the patent's name. Temporally, the poison wasn't administered on the day of death. It was placed, armed, and left to wait. It could have been there for a day, a week, a year, or longer. Corbin's mind immediately went to the two primary suspects, both insulated by distance, and alibis: Julian Croft, the tech mogul; Evelyn Vance, the vengeful niece. Their alibis for the day of the murder were irrelevant if the weapon had been planted long before. The crime scene wasn't just the study, it was the past. He returned to the manor, the weak sun casting longs, skeletal shadows of the fir trees across the stone facade. Mrs. Albright, now a silent, grey presence in the house of her long employment. Let him in. He went directly to the study, to the evidence photos of the teacup. It looked so innocent, delicate, white porcelain with a thin blue floral pattern. Part of a set he had seen in the dining room cabinet. Double quotes, Mrs. Albright. Corbin called, his voice gentle. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway, her hands twisting. Buy a dishcloth. The teacup, Mrs. Albright, the one found on Mr. Vance's desk. Did he have a habit of taking a single cup from the dining room set to use in here? She shook her head. No, never. He had his own set in here for his coffee, a simple black stoneware set. He never used the formal china. He called it frivolous Corbin's, focus sharpened. He had his own set in the study. Where did he keep it? In the small cabinet by his desk. But it was empty. The forensics people looked. I assumed he had taken the last clean cup and saucer out to use. But he didn't drink tea, and he wouldn't have used a frivolous porcelain cup. So where did this cup come from, and why was it on his desk? Corbin walked over to the desk, picturing the scene. Vance, sitting in his chair, the unfinished cipher before him. The teacup placed just so. Was it brought to him? No. The room was bolted from the inside. Did he make it himself? Why would he brew a cup of tea he didn't like, in a cup he disdained? Unless he didn't know what it was. The theory began to crystallize in Corbin's mind, cold and clear as the glass on the master clock. The teacup wasn't just the weapon. It was the Trojan horse. It had been introduced into the sanctuary, disguised, as something harmless, something that belonged. It was a foreign object, a flaw, introduced into the perfect system. He now needed the other half of the temporal equation, the trigger. The patent described a pressure-activated release, but the timing was the key. Corbin's mind went back to the cipher. The clock's hands are frozen at the dawn of the final day. It had to be a specific day, a day of significance to Vance. Corbin began a new, methodical search of the study. He wasn't looking for clues of a murder, but for markers of a life. He opened Vance's desk drawers. They were filled with files, all perfectly labeled. Astronomical complications, escapement theory, correspondence, Finch. In the bottom drawer, he found a series of leather-bound journals. They were not personal diaries in the traditional sense. There were no emotional outpourings. Instead, they were daily logs of his work, notes on atmospheric pressure, calculations, bit of tidal patterns, and observations on the slow decay of mechanical parts. It was the autobiography of a clock. Corbin began paging through the most recent volume. Each entry was dated with meticulous precision. He went back, day by day, from the date of death, and then he found it. The entry for October 24th, the day, tell. It was a single, sprawling sentence, the ink getting progressively more erratic as if written in a frantic rush. It was the Cipher. The serpent devours its own tail, yet the clock's hands are frozen at the dawn of the final day. He had written it as he was dying. It wasn't a clue he had prepared. It was his final, stunning realization. He had solved the puzzle of his own death in the moments before it claimed him. What was this final day? Corbin started going backwards, through the journals year by year, looking for any entry marked as significant on that date. October 24th, he found nothing. He pulled out the older journals. He went back 5 years, 10, 20, and then, in a journal dated 30 years prior, he found it. The entry for October 24th was stark and unlike any other. It contained no numbers, no observations, just 4 words written in a savage, angry script. The day the music died. Corbin stared at the words. He knew, from his interview with Elias Vance, what this meant. This was the day Elias had ruthlessly bought out his brother, severing their family ties and setting his father on a path to ruin. For 30 years, Elias Vance had privately marked this date, not as a celebration, but as an ending. The day the music, the harmony of his family, his past had died. It was the origin point of his self-imposed exile. It was his own personal final day. The mechanism was clear now. A teacup containing a poison dispenser was set to a timer calibrated to trigger on the dawn of a specific, deeply significant date. The poison was digoxin, subtle and cruel. The victim was a man who had made an enemy so profound, so patient, that they were willing to wait years, perhaps decades, for their revenge. Corbin closed the journal. He knew who he needed to call. There was only one person to whom that date would mean as much as it did to Elias Vance. He dialed the number for Evelyn Vance in Boston. She answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp and cool as ever. Detective Corbin, have you found the bumbling island sheriff who tripped and fell into my uncle? No, Miss Vance, Corbin said, his voice low and steady. I've found a teacup. There was a silence on the other end of the line. It was not a long silence, but it was a heavy one. The kind of silence that contains a quickly suppressed intake. Buff, I don't know what you mean, she finally said, her voice a fraction of a degree colder. I think you do, Corbin continued, walking slowly around the study, a ghost in Vance's private world. I think you know all about it. A delicate porcelain cup with a blue floral pattern. One that doesn't belong to the set in the dining room, but is a near-perfect replica. One with a false bottom, just thick enough to hold a very small, very clever mechanism. He let that hang in the air. He could hear her breathing, a faint, controlled rhythm over the line. You're speaking nonsense, she said, but the conviction was starting to fray at the edges. Let me tell you a story, Miss Vance. It's about a brilliant man who ruins his family out of pride. He has a brother whom he casts out. That brother has a daughter. The man retreats into a fortress of his own making, a world of perfect, sterile systems. The daughter grows up hearing stories of this monstrous, brilliant uncle. He is the ghost that haunts her family, the reason for their hardship. He is a puzzle she feels compelled to solve. Corbin paused, standing before the unfinished orrery clock in the workshop. Then one day, 5 years ago, she comes to visit. She stands on his doorstep, and he humiliates her, refusing to even see her. But she doesn't leave empty-handed. In her purse, she has a gift for him, a very special teacup, a replica of his family's china, the very china that represents the life he destroyed. And while the housekeeper is distracted, she finds a way into the dining room. It's a simple thing to open the cabinet, take out one of the real cups and saucers, and leave her gift in its place. A single flawed gear inserted into the great, perfect clockwork of the house. This is a fantasy, Detective. Evelyn's voice was strained now. The cup contained a device. Corbin pressed on, his voice relentless but quiet. A device based on one of her uncle's own patents, a little bit of poetry. It held a tiny reservoir of poison, digoxin, from the foxglove plant, a poison that mimics by a heart attack. And it was set on a timer, not a short timer, a long one, a 5-year timer, set to trigger on a very specific day, October 24th, the anniversary of the day her uncle destroyed her father. She set the trap, and then she walked away and let time do the rest. For 5 years, that teacup sat in the cabinet, a silent, waiting assassin. The only sound from the phone was a faint, shuddering breath. But how did it get from the cabinet to his desk? Corbin asked, posing the final question. That's the part that's truly brilliant. The part that shows you understood him perfectly. You knew he was a creature of absolute routine, but also of deep, secret sentimentality. Cups you gambled that on that day, the 30th anniversary of his great betrayal, he would do something out of the ordinary, that he would be drawn to the past, that he might, just might, walk to the dining room, see that single cup from his old life, and take it, a relic, a moment of connection to the world he had renounced. You gambled that his pride and his pain would make him pick up the weapon of his own execution. He continued. The mechanism was pressure activated. The moment he picked it up, the timer would arm itself. It was set for dawn, let's say 7 a.m. At that moment, the device would inject the colorless, odorless poison into whatever liquid was in the cup. Or, perhaps, it simply released a small amount of poisoned residue into the empty cup. Later that day, haunted by the anniversary, he forgoes his usual coffee and, on a whim, decides to use the relic. He pours hot water in for tea, dissolving the poison. He takes a sip, and his own perfect internal clock begins to fail. There was a long, ragged sigh from the other end of the line. It was the sound of a 5-year-old tension finally breaking. He sent my father puzzles, Evelyn Vance said, her voice suddenly small, stripped of its icy armor. Bearer, every year for his birthday. Horrible, complicated things. Cryptograms, mechanical riddles, just to prove he was better, smarter, to remind my father of everything he had lost. I wanted to send him one back, a final puzzle, one he'd wouldn't solve until it was too late. It was a confession, quiet, bitter, and absolute. He almost did, Corbin said, his gaze falling on the cipher on the desk. He figured it out. In the end, he knew. The rest was a formality. Evelyn Vance offered no resistance. Her confession over the phone, though not admissible in court on its own, was a key. With the theory of the crime established, the forensics team re-examined the teacup. They found the microscopic seal in the base. They found trace residue of the digoxin and the faint mechanical signature of the device. They found the original, non-lethal cup from the set hidden in the back of Evelyn's closet in Boston during a warranted search. The puzzle was complete. The case was closed. Detective Corbin stayed on Solitude Island for one more day. He stood on the cliffs, watching the gray Pacific waves crash against the basalt. He thought of Elias Vance, a man so insulated by genius and pride that he couldn't see the simple, human emotion that would be his undoing. He had built a fortress against the world, but the real danger was never from the outside. It was from a wound he himself had inflicted 30 years ago. A wound that had festered in the heart of his family. He thought of the Cipher, Vance's last act. It wasn't a clue for the police. It was a final, bitter acknowledgement from the master clockmaker. He had seen the flaw in his own system at the very last second. The serpent, his perfect, self-contained life, had been stopped cold by an impurity. A poison introduced from his own past. As evening fell, Corbin returned the keys of the manor to a somber Mrs. Albright. The house was now truly silent. The grand master clock in the study had finally been stopped, its pendulum stilled. The cosmic clock in the workshop would remain forever unfinished, a monument to a life interrupted. The mystery of Blackwood Manor was over. It ended not with a bang, but with the quiet ticking of a clock that had finally, inexorably, run down. It was a cold case, born of a cold heart, and solved in the cold, misty air of a forgotten island. And now the story is told. The fire is burning down to embers, casting a warm, sleepy glow. The rain has softened to a gentle whisper against the glass. The puzzle is solved. The ghosts are laid to rest, and there is nothing left but the quiet of the night. Settle in. Let the peace of the resolution wash over you. There are no more secrets to uncover here. There is only warmth and quiet, and the gentle promise of sleep. Good night.